I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the slow drip of the coffee maker, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. At 70 years old, I've learned that unexpected calls rarely bring good news. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the voice I heard. Mrs. Rowan? This is Attorney Markham. I'm calling regarding your grandfather's estate. We need to finalize documents for your 60% share. I nearly dropped the phone. 60%. Of what? I swallowed, steadied myself, and asked him to repeat it. He did, calm as a man reciting grocery items. 60% of the estate, as stipulated by your grandfather's will. My heart thudded in my chest, beating with confusion, disbelief, and something darker, an instinctive understanding that someone had kept this from me. Someone close. Someone who had decided deliberately that I didn't deserve to know. Because here's the truth. Grandpa died 8 months earlier. I had mourned him quietly, privately, and from afar because I was told, by my own family, that there wasn't much of an estate, that everything was handled, and that there wasn't anything for me to worry about. I believed them. Foolish, perhaps, but family has a way of convincing you to trust them, especially when you're tired and healing from your own losses. I remembered that week vividly. My nephew Aaron had been the one who called me when Grandpa passed. His voice had been sympathetic, warm. He told me the funeral would be small. He told me there wasn't much left, just old furniture and memories. I thanked him. I sent money to help with arrangements. And I stayed home, recovering from hip surgery, wishing I could be there but trusting that my family was doing right by Grandpa. Months passed. Silence grew. Not once did anyone mention a will. Not my nephew. Not my brother. Not the daughters of my late sister. Not a single one of them. Yet now a stranger, a lawyer, was telling me that I held the majority share of an estate I didn't even know existed. I stared at the dim morning light pouring through my window, pooling on the hardwood floor like a soft accusation. Mr. Markham, I said carefully, why am I only hearing about this now? There was a pause, the kind that tells you someone is choosing their words with surgical precision. That, he said, is something you will likely need to ask your family. My family. The people who had gathered together 8 months ago, in the house where I once spent my happiest childhood summers, evidently dividing something far more valuable than old furniture and memories. The people who had chosen to make decisions without me. And the people who, as it turned out, had been perfectly content to keep my 60% share hidden, hoping I would never know. But the notary had called. And that one ring, thin, sharp, and unavoidable, set into motion a truth they had worked very hard to bury. My name is Margaret Rowan, though most people simply call me Maggie. I'm 70 years old, and I've lived long enough to know that betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles across a dinner table. And sometimes it carries your own last name. I live alone now, in a small cedar-sided house on the edge of a marsh where the herons wander freely and the mornings carry the cool scent of sea wind. I've built a peaceful life here, quiet, thoughtful, measured. After my husband passed, I learned to love my solitude. It gives me space to breathe, to think, to listen to what my body and spirit ask of me. For years I believed my family respected that distance. I never imagined they were using it. I am not a dramatic woman, nor am I vindictive by nature. I've spent most of my life as a school librarian, encouraging young minds, mediating squabbles, teaching patience and fairness. You learn, in that kind of work, how to observe without reacting too quickly. You learn to read between lines. You learn when someone is lying. And as I sat with the phone still warm in my hand after the attorney hung up, I felt that familiar, unmistakable sensation. A quiet click in the mind, like a book spine opening to a chapter you've read before. Something was wrong. And this time, it was personal. I replayed the conversations from 8 months earlier, now hearing their jittery edges and false reassurances with brutal new clarity. My nephew avoiding details. My brother telling me the will was simple. My nieces insisting everything was being handled. Strange, How simple things suddenly become complicated when they fall under the light of truth. I poured myself a cup of coffee, but it tasted different, bitter, metallic, like betrayal had seeped into its heat. I stood at the window and watched the marsh grass sway in the wind, remembering the gentle steadiness of my grandfather's hand as he taught me how to plant tomatoes in his backyard garden. He used to say, "There will come a day, Maggie girl, when you'll need to stand up for yourself with your back straight and your heart steady." I never expected that day to arrive at 70. And I never expected it to be triggered by the lies of my own blood. But I have always believed in truth. Truth is patient. Truth is persistent. And truth, even when buried deep, has a way of rising to the surface, usually at the most inconvenient time for those who try to hide it. So I set my mug down, took a breath, and made a decision. Whatever my family had done, whatever they believed I didn't need to know, I would uncover every detail. Calmly, rationally, methodically. Because revenge, ethical revenge, is not about rage. It is about clarity. And I was finally, painfully, becoming clear. I come from a small family, the kind that appears close-knit from the outside but frays at the seams when pulled by responsibility. My only sibling is my younger brother, Paul. A man who thrives on being the first to know things and the last to admit wrongdoing. Growing up, he was the charming one, the silver-tongued negotiator. I was the quiet shadow beside him, more at home with books than with arguments. Our parents passed early, and Grandpa became the anchor. When my sister died 10 years ago, her two daughters, Emily and Sarah, folded themselves into the family's remaining structure. My nephew Aaron, Paul's son, rounded out the next generation. We were not perfect, but we were functional enough. Holidays, phone calls, occasional disagreements. Life-sized, ordinary family things. But when Grandpa's health began to decline, something shifted. I could feel it even from a distance. They visited him more often than usual, not out of affection, I later realized, but calculation. I had been recovering from my hip surgery then, unable to travel easily. I trusted Paul to oversee things. And he did, in his way. Efficiently, quietly, without involving me. The day Grandpa passed, Aaron called with words that sounded gentle, but now, looking back, carried a thin strand of orchestration. "Aunt Maggie, please don't stress about anything. We're taking care of all the arrangements. Grandpa didn't have much left, so there's nothing to worry about. You just focus on healing." Nothing to worry about. The refrain they fed me for months. And I believed it because they were my family. The funeral came and went without me. I watched a live stream from my recliner, clutching tissues, unable to shake the feeling that I should have been there, even if it meant pain or complications. But I told myself it was fine. They were there. They were representing the family. They were, as it now seems, representing their own interests. Because if the lawyer had not called me, I suspect my name would never have surfaced again. My 60% share would have quietly dissolved into their pockets, absorbed into whatever division they had crafted behind closed doors. Had they planned to contest the will? Forge signatures? Claim I had refused my inheritance? I didn't know yet. But I knew this. Their silence had not been accidental. Families fracture in many ways. Sometimes through harsh words shouted in kitchens. Sometimes through secrets wrapped in pretty excuses. And sometimes through calculated omissions disguised as kindness. Mine chose the latter. But what they didn't anticipate, what they could never have anticipated, was that Grandpa's attorney was old-fashioned, meticulous, bound by professional duty. And when someone holds 60% of an estate, they must be contacted. Legally. Formally. Without exception. So despite my family's efforts, my phone rang. And when I learned that truth, something in me, the part that had always been quiet, forgiving, deferential, sat up straight. I may be 70. But I am not helpless. And I am not a woman who walks away from injustice, especially when it carries my grandfather's name. 2 days after the call, the notary emailed me the preliminary inventory of the estate. I sat in my reading chair as the document loaded, expecting perhaps a modest sum. Maybe Grandpa had saved more than we realized. Maybe the house held more value than expected. But nothing prepared me for what appeared on the screen. Grandpa had owned 30 acres of coastal woodland. Land he had purchased decades earlier for a song, but which was now worth a small fortune due to development pressures. More than that, he had significant savings, investments, and a life insurance policy I never knew existed. The estate was valued at just over $3 million. I pressed a hand against my chest, stunned not by the money itself. At my age, I have simple tastes and modest needs, but by what this revelation said about my family's intentions. They didn't simply hide a small inheritance. They hid a fortune. And in doing so, they tried to rob me of the legacy my grandfather intended for me. 60%. More than half. A deliberate choice on Grandpa's part. Why? The answer unraveled slowly, painfully, as I reread the will. He had left the majority to me because I had cared for him for years. Before my surgery, before distance pressed itself between us. I visited him monthly, called weekly, helped manage his medications, his appointments, his meals. I paid for repairs on his house when his roof leaked. I was the one who showed up. And Grandpa remembered. My family, it seems, remembered too, but for different reasons. The more I read, the more the betrayal sharpened into something solid, almost metallic. They hadn't just excluded me. They had gathered as a group, reviewed the will, made their divisions, and intentionally decided not to tell me a thing. I found out later, from the attorney, that Paul had told him I was too ill to be burdened with estate matters. A clever phrase. Harmless on its surface. But beneath it lay a purposeful deceit. They had requested that all mail be directed to Paul's address. They claimed I preferred not to be involved. They assured the notary that I would sign whatever was necessary once I had recovered. All lies. And had the attorney been less diligent, had he trusted their coordinated narrative, I would have lost everything my grandfather left me. I closed my laptop slowly, breathing through the controlled burn of betrayal. They hadn't just taken money. They had taken my grandfather's intentions, my place in his legacy, my right to grieve with dignity, my trust. That kind of theft is not measured in dollars. And though I do not believe in vengeance born of fury, I do believe in justice shaped by truth. So that evening, as the marsh darkened and the herons settled into quiet silhouettes, I opened a notebook and began to write. Dates, names, conversations, inconsistencies, a timeline of their deception. If they wanted to remove me from Grandpa's story, they underestimated the librarian in me. I document everything. And I never lose a paper trail. The next morning, I called Attorney Markham. His voice held a careful respect now, the kind reserved for someone who has been wronged. I'd like to review all documentation, I told him. Every letter, every email, every signature. He agreed immediately. Within hours, a folder arrived in my inbox. I printed everything, laid the pages across my dining table, and examined them with a precision honed from decades of cataloging archives. The pattern was unmistakable. Paul had positioned himself as the main contact. My nieces and nephew supported this narrative through coordinated emails. They described me as frail, overwhelmed, even confused, a portrait painted so subtly that it might have gone unquestioned. But the most damning evidence was an unsigned draft letter, one they clearly intended to send on my behalf, stating that I declined my inheritance rights and wished the estate to be divided evenly among the others. My breath left me in a slow, disbelieving exhale. They had planned to erase me. If not for one detail. The notary insisted that any such letter had to be signed in person. My family stalled, creating excuses for my absence, hoping the estate could be settled quickly, quietly. But the law has its safeguards. And truth, even when cornered, finds its way out. I shared everything with Markham. His response was measured but firm. Mrs. Rowan, what they attempted is fraud. I can file a formal notice and, if necessary, pursue civil action. I considered this carefully. The younger version of me might have hesitated, but at 70, clarity is a gift. Do it, I said. But I didn't stop there. I called my doctor and requested my medical records from that period. They showed normal cognitive function, stable recovery, full decision-making ability. I dug through my emails and messages. Nothing from my family about the will, the estate, or legal documents. Not one attempt to involve me. I even contacted my old neighbor from Grandpa's town, who confirmed that he saw Paul and the others at the house multiple times after Grandpa's death, removing items, discussing property boundaries. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. And once assembled, it told a story of deliberate exclusion. When Markham sent the formal inquiry to my family, requesting documentation of my supposed refusal, their response arrived in a flurry of panicked messages. Texts. Calls. Emails dripping with false innocence. Aunt Maggie, there's been a misunderstanding. We thought you weren't up to handling complex matters. We were protecting you. It's not what it looks like. But I knew better. Protecting me would have meant telling the truth. So I remained calm, silent, measured, exactly the way one must be when the truth is on their side and the guilty have begun to sweat. And as the investigation grew deeper, as inconsistencies surfaced like bones rising through soft earth, I realized something profound. They had orchestrated a betrayal behind my back. But now, I would confront them face to face. With evidence. With composure. With the quiet force of a woman who refuses to be erased. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon at the notary's office. A neutral space, as Markham recommended. Structured, formal, impossible to manipulate. I prepared for it like one prepares for a long-awaited storm. Not with fear, but with steadiness. I dressed simply, gray slacks, a navy sweater, and the pearl necklace my grandfather gave me when I turned 50. I packed my notebook, my medical records, printed copies of emails, and the unsigned draft letter. Years ago, confrontation would have rattled me. But age teaches you something invaluable. The power of calm. When you do not shout, people must lean in to hear you. And leaning in reveals their discomfort. I arrived 15 minutes early. Markham greeted me warmly, his presence solid, reassuring. Then, one by one, my family arrived. Paul entered first, his smile forced, shoulders tight. Aaron followed, eyes shifting nervously. My nieces entered last, whispering among themselves, their guilt thinly veiled beneath strained politeness. When everyone was seated, Markham began. Thank you all for coming. We are here to clarify matters regarding the estate of Mr. Rowan and to address several inconsistencies that have arisen. Paul spoke before he finished. There must be some mistake. We were just trying to simplify things. But Markham continued, unshaken. Mrs. Rowan was not notified of her 60% inheritance. You all claimed she had declined involvement. Yet there is no record of her stating this, nor any signed document to that effect. The room tightened, air thickening like a rope pulling taut. My moment had come. I looked at each of them, slowly, intentionally, and when I spoke, my voice was steady. I trusted all of you. I trusted that Grandpa's memory was being honored. Instead, I was excluded, deceived, and nearly written out. My nieces lowered their eyes. Aaron shifted uncomfortably. But Paul, he lifted his chin. We didn't think you'd care, he said. A quiet, trembling fury rippled through me. Not the volatile kind, but the righteous, mournful kind that comes when someone you once loved shows you exactly who they are. You didn't think I'd care about Grandpa's wishes? Or you didn't think I'd find out? I asked. He didn't answer. I opened my notebook and placed the printed draft letter on the table. This, I said, was not protection. This was fraud. Silence followed. A long, heavy silence. They realized then that I wasn't confused. I wasn't weak. And I wasn't stepping aside. I turned to Markham. Please proceed with full execution of the will as written. and file whatever notices are required regarding their attempts to obstruct it. My family stared at me, stunned. I had chosen my path. Not vengeance, but truth. Not punishment, but accountability. Not rage, but resolve. This was the moment I stood up straight, just as Grandpa told me all those years ago. And this was the moment my family finally understood. I was not the woman they could push aside. The legal process unfolded slowly, methodically, like a controlled burn that consumes only what must be cleared. And each step of it revealed just how deeply my family had entangled themselves in their own web. The estate was frozen temporarily while the notary documented their obstruction. Markham submitted the inquiry to the state probate court, which triggered a formal review. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but an official evaluation that required my family to provide full transparency. Paul panicked first. His emails became frantic, shifting from defensive to pleading in a matter of days. Then came the justifications, excuses layered with self-preservation. We thought you wouldn't want the stress. We were going to tell you eventually. You know how complicated these things are. We only took what we thought was fair. But fairness has never been measured by silence or secrecy. The court demanded all financial transactions related to Grandpa's property. Every bank transfer. Every sale of personal items. Every appraisal. Every receipt. And slowly, inevitably, the truth surfaced. They had already divided and sold several pieces of valuable equipment from Grandpa's workshop, illegally, without probate approval. They had split the proceeds among themselves, assuming it would never come to light. They had attempted to refinance part of the land using the estate as collateral, something that is explicitly prohibited before formal distribution. They had even held private family meetings to discuss how best to minimize Aunt Maggie's involvement. Their downfall arrived not with dramatic explosions, but with quiet, devastating paperwork. The probate officer issued a formal reprimand. They had acted in bad faith. This meant they were barred from serving as representatives of the estate and forced to return or repay any assets they had mishandled. But the most significant consequence was simpler, cleaner, more poetic. The will would be executed as written. 60% to me. 40% divided among the four of them. Their plan, built on secrecy and arrogance, collapsed under the weight of its own dishonesty. In the weeks that followed, my family fell into a strange silence. Calls dwindled. Messages stopped. Holidays passed without invitations. I felt the distance widening, not sharp, not cruel, but inevitable. A consequence of their own making. But there was no satisfaction in watching their discomfort. Only a quiet understanding that integrity has a price, and so does betrayal. And yet, the irony is that I never sought to punish them. All I wanted was the truth. And once the truth stood in the open, their own actions carried the weight of justice. The land was appraised, subdivided, and prepared for transfer. My nieces and nephew withdrew from the process, embarrassed. Paul became formal, distant, careful with his words. The once familiar warmth of family ties cooled to something thin and fragile. But I remained calm, present, and resolute. Revenge had never been my aim. But accountability, that, Grandpa would have respected. When everything settled, papers signed, accounts finalized, I found myself sitting on my porch overlooking the marsh, the late afternoon sun turning the water into molten gold. The weight I carried for months eased into something softer. Not victory, not triumph, just clarity. I inherited the largest share of the estate, yes. But what mattered more to me was understanding why Grandpa left it that way. He trusted me. He believed in me. He saw the quiet work I had done for years, the love given without condition, the care offered without expectation of reward. Knowing that eased an ache I didn't realize I'd been holding. I used part of the inheritance to repair Grandpa's old house and turned it into a retreat center for local teachers. A quiet place for rest and reflection, something I know he would have appreciated. The land, I kept intact. I placed it under conservation protection to preserve the woodland exactly as Grandpa loved it, untouched, wild, humming with life. As for my family, time created its own distance. Aaron reached out first, apologizing through a halting voicemail. He admitted that he went along with the plan because he was afraid to challenge his father. I believed him. Youth often confuses compliance with loyalty. My nieces wrote letters, real ones, ink on paper, expressing regret. They, too, had been swept into the momentum of Paul's decisions. Forgiveness came easily for them. Not reconciliation, not a return to old dynamics, but forgiveness. But Paul remained silent. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps angry. Perhaps both. We encountered each other once, months later, at a grocery store. He paused when he saw me, eyes flicking to the floor, then back to my face. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he murmured. I nodded. "But you meant for it to begin." The words hung there, gentle, honest, final. He didn't argue. He only nodded and walked away. And in that moment, I realized something important. Closure isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet acknowledgement that someone cannot meet you where truth requires them to stand. And that's enough. I spent the following months tending my garden, hosting small gatherings at the retreat center, rediscovering the reliability of my own company. The marsh birds became my daily companions, their slow wing beats a reminder of the calm I fought so hard to reclaim. And though my family's betrayal still lingered in the edges of memory, it no longer stung. It simply existed. A chapter with lessons etched in its margins. Just as Grandpa would have wanted. If there is one truth I've learned in 70 years, it is this. Silence is where betrayal grows. Documentation is where justice begins. And calm is where power lives. My family expected my age to make me passive. They mistook my quiet nature for weakness. They assumed distance meant disinterest. But distance only sharpens perspective. And quiet only strengthens resolve. When someone attempts to erase you, whether from a will, a conversation, or a family, do not fight with noise. Fight with truth. Fight with clarity. Fight with the confidence of someone who knows they have nothing to hide. Ethical revenge is not about hurting others. It is about illuminating what they hoped would stay in shadows. And when the light appears, people expose themselves, sometimes in ways that speak louder than any confrontation. If you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, remember this. Stay calm. Gather evidence. Ask questions. Document everything. Let their actions build the case for you. And above all, protect your peace. Money fades. Land changes hands. Property crumbles over time. But justice, once earned, builds something far more lasting. Self-respect. My grandfather left me 60% of his estate. But what he truly left me was the final lesson of his long, wise life. When others choose deception, choose truth. When others choose greed, choose dignity. When others try to diminish you, stand up, quietly, clearly, fully. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance is not wealth, but the strength to defend what is rightfully yours. And if you're listening to my story today, perhaps it's because you, too, are standing at the edge of your own turning point. So ask yourself, what would you reclaim if you stopped accepting silence as an answer? And what truth is waiting, patiently, insistently, for you to bring it into the light?